Lucas had always known he was different. Not in the obvious ways. He was unremarkably handsome, with kind, tired eyes and hands roughened by honest work, but in the way certain places spoke to him. Not loudly, not with words, but with a familiarity so deep it tugged at the edges of memory he didn't recall making. So when he first laid eyes on the old French-style villa nestled quietly in the misty suburbs of Chanteloun, he didn't hesitate. The wrought iron gates creaked open with a sound that felt like an echo. Not of something he'd heard before, but of something he'd once felt. He walked up the stone path lined with lavender and weathered statues, his boots brushing against fallen petals. Something in his chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. The job listing had been simple: seeking full-time gardener. Discretion and attention to detail required. Room provided. No photos, no names. But when he arrived, the house seemed to rise from the earth like it had been waiting. And so had she. Eleanor Beaumont, as she insisted, was not what Lucas had expected. At 28, she carried the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Her beauty was not delicate but deliberate: porcelain skin, dark eyes that seemed to weigh every word before it left her lips, and an ever-present smudge of dust on her fingers from restoring something old. She'd inherited the estate from her great-grandmother, a woman Lucas had never met but somehow felt had once known him. Elle was skeptical at first. She had interviewed others, more qualified perhaps, but none had looked at the garden the way Lucas did. He walked among the roses not as a laborer, but as someone visiting old friends. Within hours, he had identified herbs growing wild behind the greenhouse and trimmed the ivy from the marble sundial without being told. When she asked how he knew to do that, he only shrugged and said, "It felt right." In truth, Lucas didn't understand it either. He had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes and schools, never putting down roots. He wasn't trained in horticulture, but in the first week at the Beaumont estate, he restored a decaying hedge maze with the precision of someone who'd designed it. Elle began to watch him from the windows. At first, it was curiosity, then fascination, then something gentler. She noticed the way he moved, deliberate and patient, as though tending to memories, not just plants. He sang quietly to himself sometimes, old, melodic lines from no song she could place. At night, Lucas dreamed, always the same: a garden in full bloom under a twilight sky, a woman in a green velvet dress, and himself in an old-fashioned waistcoat. They met under the rose-covered trellis, laughing softly, fingers tangled like vines. He always woke before she turned her face fully to him. One morning, over tea in the kitchen, Elle asked about his past. He hesitated, then told her the truth: orphaned as a baby, no known relatives, no records of birth beyond a name and a date. She looked at him as if seeing something she hadn't before, not pity, but a puzzle piece clicking into place. Their connection deepened. It wasn't dramatic, but subtle: shared glances, the exchange of books, the way Elle began leaving out an extra teacup. Lucas found himself humming when she passed by, unconsciously, and Elle, though she rarely smiled, would sometimes linger near the garden bench where he sat to sketch plant patterns. It was during one of the spring rains that she finally invited him inside, not to the grand parlor or formal dining room, but to the basement. It was where she kept pieces waiting for restoration. That day, she was cataloging old portraits stored in dust cloths. Lucas followed her down the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath their feet. The basement smelled of time, of paper, cedar, and fading varnish, and there, propped against the far wall, was a large canvas. Elle pulled the cloth away slowly, revealing a painting dated 1920. The colors were muted but clear: a man in a dark vest and tie, standing in the same garden Lucas tended daily. His hair was slicked back, his posture proud, but it was the face that stole the breath from Lucas's lungs. It was his face, not similar, not reminiscent. It was him, down to the slope of the brow, the curve of the jaw, the scar near the temple. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The only sound was the distant thunder above. Elle stepped closer, her fingers hovering near the canvas. "His name was Julian Darcy," she whispered. "He was my great-grandmother's fiancé. He disappeared before the wedding. No one ever found out why." Lucas stared at the man he had never met, and yet, somehow, had always been. The garden above their heads felt heavier. The air shifted. Something had been waiting beneath the roots, beneath the years, and now, it had awakened. He touched the frame. A memory, not his, flickered. A rose pressed into a book. A voice saying, "Promise me, you'll come back." Then it was gone. Elle looked at him, eyes wide with something between fear and wonder. "Lucas, who are you?" He didn't have the answer. But in his chest, something ancient stirred, and it whispered, "You've always been here." Outside, the rain softened. In the garden, the first rose of the season bloomed. And deep in the soil, a story prepared to repeat itself. In the dim, musky air of the basement, the dust danced like slow snowflakes in the glow of a single swinging bulb. Elle stepped carefully down the stone steps, the silence wrapping around her like a shawl. She hadn't been down here since the move. Most of the old furniture and artifacts from her great-grandmother's time were boxed up, forgotten in the shadows. But today, something tugged at her, a curiosity she couldn't name. Lucas followed her down, his boots making soft, deliberate echoes against the cold floor. He held the small lantern they'd found earlier. Its light revealed carved trunks, rusted birdcages, cracked porcelain dolls, the remnants of another life. Elle moved toward a cloth-covered canvas leaning against the far wall. The fabric, once white, had gone the color of dried bones. She touched it, fingers trembling slightly, and began to pull the cover free. What emerged took her breath. A man in formal 1920s attire stared out from the painting. Eyes deep and enigmatic, he wore a dark vest, his hand resting lightly on a cane. Behind him bloomed a wall of roses, eerily similar to the trellis in her own garden. But it was the face, his face, that made Elle step back. The resemblance to Lucas wasn't just uncanny, it was almost impossible. Same sharp jawline, same eyes, melancholic, intelligent, burdened. Lucas approached slowly, puzzled by her expression. When she turned the canvas toward him, he froze. The lantern slipped slightly in his grip. "I've been here," he whispered, so softly she barely heard it. "I've stood exactly here." His voice held no playfulness, no disbelief, only the weight of recognition. Elle stared between him and the painting, her heart thudding. She had always been a skeptic, of spirits, of reincarnation, of anything that couldn't be filed under logic. But Lucas was pale now, visibly shaken, and his eyes shimmered with something between fear and awe. He stepped forward, brushing his fingers over the brushstrokes. This was the garden, before the renovations, and her. He pointed beyond the painted roses, to a woman whose figure barely emerged from shadow. "She used to sing to me. I remember a song about swallows and winter rain." Elle's mouth went dry. She pulled the canvas back against the wall, her hand trembling. The signature at the bottom caught her eye, E. de Marais. Her great-grandmother, the woman who had vanished in 1923 without a trace. The painting was dated a year earlier, 1922. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. He wandered the grounds under the pale light of a half-moon, fingers trailing the vines along the old trellis. The dreams had returned in pieces, fragments that fluttered like moths too fast to catch. A kiss stolen under a veil of roses. Blood on his shirt. A man's shout. A scream that didn't sound like fear, but betrayal. In the morning, he sat in the garden, fingernails caked with dirt, staring at the sky. Elle brought him tea and crouched beside him. "Are you all right?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then, "I think I've done this before. All of it." "Lucas, you said you grew up in a group home. Is it possible you saw the painting somewhere? Maybe read about this place?" "No." His eyes found hers, unwavering. "I didn't know this estate existed until I walked up to the gate. But my body, my bones, they remember. I knew the path to the east wall before I'd ever seen it. And last night, I dreamt of the fountain. The one buried under the hedges. Elle felt her spine chill. There was an old foundation beneath the hedges. Her great-grandmother's diary had mentioned it once. In passing, no maps, no photos, just a memory. Later that day, Lucas was working near the rose garden when his spade struck something hard. A round, metallic clink. He knelt, brushed away the soil. It was a rusted piece of jewelry, an old locket. Inside, behind the cracked glass, was a photo of Ida Marais, and the same man from the painting. Elle, watching from the veranda, couldn't breathe. That evening, she scoured the attic for her family's genealogical records, pulling out brittle papers, old letters, and a few journals. Most were in French, faded with time. One note, translated roughly, read, "Louis disappeared last summer. They said he ran, but I know better. He told me he would wait. Even in another life, I painted him in the roses. I wanted the world to see his face one more time before it was taken from me." Lucas stood behind her, the locket in his hand. "That was me," he said. "I feel it." "Do you believe in reincarnation?" she asked. "I didn't, until now." The next morning, Lucas woke with a start. He had dreamed of blood again, this time vivid. He stood behind the rose arbor, yelling at someone. There was a scuffle. He was pushed. Something pierced his side. Then the roses turned red. When he looked at his arm, a thin scratch ran from his elbow to wrist. He didn't remember getting it. Didn't know how it had bled onto the sheets. Elle's hands trembled as she helped him wrap the wound. They no longer talked about, if only, what next? The garden watched them. The past breathed between the petals. And somewhere under the soil, a story long buried began to bloom again. The days that followed blurred like brushstrokes in rain. Time stretched and contracted, folding over itself in ways Elle couldn't grasp. Her mind was filled with fragments, Lucas's stare at the painting. The dreams, the locket buried in the earth. Something ancient had begun to stir. And it refused to be ignored. Lucas changed. Or perhaps, Elle realized, he was simply shedding the version of himself that had been borrowed for this life. His words grew strange, tinged with a cadence from another era. He would call her Ma Kerry in a way that felt instinctive. He spoke of promises made in twilight gardens and of running barefoot across dewy grass beneath the stars. One morning, he looked at her with eyes full of tears and whispered, "You said you'd come back for me. And I waited." Elle began journaling, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Her entries were raw, confessions of fear and longing, of doubt and yearning. She documented every odd phrase Lucas uttered, every inexplicable moment. She started comparing them with the diary entries and letters she'd found in the attic. The overlap was unnerving. Then came the letter. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out book, brittle and yellowed, written in delicate script. It was from her great-grandmother to someone named Elle. The lines spoke of forbidden meetings, of shared dreams and whispered plans. But one phrase stopped Elle cold. "We made a vow under the roses. If this life separates us, I'll find you in the next." It was almost identical to something Lucas had said in his sleep just nights earlier. That day, Elle walked through the garden with trembling hands. The trellis of roses Lucas had carefully cultivated now arched exactly as it had in the painting. It wasn't merely similar, it was identical. The color, the curvature, the way the vines curled like fingers around the posts. It was as if he'd rebuilt the memory, petal by petal. The dreams returned to Elle, too, vivid and startling. In them, she was dressed in a flowing cream gown, running through the garden with blood on her hands. She looked over her shoulder in terror, not at Lucas, but at someone else, always unseen, but always near. One evening, as the moon began its slow climb into a cloudless sky, Lucas approached her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "You need to leave," he said. Elle blinked. "What? Why?" He looked away, jaw clenched. "Something's coming. I don't know what exactly. But I feel it. In my bones. In the earth beneath our feet. It's tied to the full moon. You can't be here." She refused. "No, You're not pushing me away again. Not in this life. If something is coming, we face it together." Lucas stared at her then, long and hard, as if trying to determine whether she was truly who he remembered. Finally, he whispered, "You left before. You promised. And you left." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't know. I didn't remember, but I'm here now. Doesn't that count for something?" He nodded slowly, a man caught between past and present. Thunder cracked across the sky, sudden, unnatural. The wind stirred violently, though the trees hadn't moved all day. Lucas turned from her without another word, walking toward the tool shed. Moments later, he emerged holding a rusted spade. It was old, older than anything Elle recognized, and she had never seen it before. The iron was pitted and worn, the wood dark with age and something else, something that looked like dried blood. Elle watched him disappear into the roses, the spade in hand. The moonlight kissed the garden with a silver sheen, and for a breathless moment, the past seemed to fold into the present. In the silence, Elle whispered a name she didn't know she remembered. Louis. Somewhere, the roses trembled, and the story they thought had ended was only now beginning again. The first sound Elle heard was the faint thud of metal striking earth. It was subtle, almost rhythmic, like a metronome counting down toward something inevitable. She blinked awake in the dark, heart pounding, and turned to the window. Outside, bathed in moonlight that turned the garden silver, Lucas was digging beneath the arched trellis of roses. He moved methodically, shoveling the soil in solemn repetition, as though he were unearthing something sacred, or cursed. Elle pushed herself out of bed, threw on a robe, and slipped down the stairs barefoot. The door creaked open, cool air licking at her skin. "Lucas," she called softly. He didn't answer. His eyes, when she reached him, were vacant, distant, fixed on the dirt like a man in trance. She grabbed his arm. He flinched but did not resist. The moon cast pale shadows across his face, and he looked older in that light. Or perhaps simply eternal. With a final strike, the spade hit wood. They both froze. Lucas dropped to his knees, fingers trembling as he brushed away layers of earth. Slowly, he unearthed a weathered wooden box. Its hinges rusted, corners swollen with age. He opened it. Inside were fragments of bone, brittle and pale, tangled in decayed velvet lining. A necklace lay among them, its chain dulled by time but still intact. And beneath it, a piece of parchment, soaked in something brown and stiff with age. Lucas stared at the contents. His lips moved without sound. Then, finally, he whispered, "I found myself," and broke. He folded inward, clutching the box, sobbing like a man who had just remembered every pain he'd ever carried across lifetimes. Elle knelt beside him, her hands hovering helplessly. "Lucas, what is this? What does it mean?" Before he could answer, a new voice emerged from the darkness. "It means the dead don't stay buried forever." Startled, Elle turned. A tall, older man stood just beyond the trellis. Framed by the moonlight, he wore a coat too elegant for midnight visits and held a cane not for support, but ceremony. "Who are you?" Elle demanded, rising to her feet. He stepped closer. The resemblance to one of the portraits in the upstairs hallway was unmistakable. "Henry de Marais," he said, "my great-grandfather was your great-grandmother's husband." Elle's breath caught. Henry, the name had been mentioned only briefly in her grandmother's letters, as a man of pride and status. Protective to a fault. Henry glanced at the open box, then at Lucas. There was no shock in his expression, only resignation. Louis was the gardener, Henry said. He loved her, and she was willing to throw everything away for him. My great-grandfather found out. They argued in this garden. There was a struggle. He claimed it was an accident. But Henry looked down. He buried him here, told no one, and then, just weeks later, your great-grandmother vanished. Lucas, still on his knees, whispered, "She never left. She followed me, through time, through death." Henry's eyes narrowed. "You don't believe that, do you, that you're him?" Lucas raised his gaze, and in that moment, something passed between him, ancient, unspoken. I don't have to believe. I remember. Henry looked away, suddenly ashamed. Our family kept the secret to protect our name. But it was never ours to keep. Lucas turned to Elle, his voice breaking. You know now. You remember. You feel it, don't you, that we were something, once. And that we were broken. Elle nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Yes, and this time, I won't run. I won't leave you. He reached for her hand. And she took it, kneeling beside him in the earth. Henry backed away, silent, letting the garden hold its breath again. In the soil, under the roses, a truth had been unearthed. And with it, the start of something that refused to die. The moon cast long shadows across the garden as the three of them stood there, past, present, and promise, waiting to see what dawn might bring. 1 year later, the estate that once whispered secrets beneath rose-covered arches had been transformed. Elle, now a woman known across the region not just for her inheritance but for her endurance, opened the Beaumont estate to the public as a private historical garden and memory gallery. She called it, the garden that remembers. Visitors came from cities and small towns alike, drawn by the rumors, the beauty, and the tragedy that lingered like perfume in the air. The centerpiece of the gallery was a large portrait that hung in the main hall. Painted in 1920, it featured a striking young man in a dark vest and tie, standing under a familiar arch of roses. It was the same face that now walked the grounds from time to time. Only older, more knowing, Lucas. Beside it was a second painting, new but hauntingly classical. Elle had commissioned it herself, a double portrait of her and Lucas, seated in the garden with their hands gently touching, posed precisely as in the older painting. The composition was eerily symmetrical. Time had folded in on itself. 2 moments, 2 lifetimes, were now one. Guests would often stop before the paintings and whisper, "They haven't aged a day." Elle never denied the observation. She would simply smile and say, "Some people never got to finish their story. We're just making sure it gets the ending it deserves." Lucas still lived with her, but he often left for weeks, sometimes longer, traveling to old estates, forgotten ruins, or antique shops in search of something he never quite explained. Elle didn't press him. She knew that pieces of a past life don't come all at once. They come in dreams. In déjà vu, in the ache of familiarity. One summer night, when the moon was high and the garden bathed in silver, Elle stood by the window. Down in the garden, Lucas was under the trellis again, dressed in a simple white shirt. His hair moved slightly with the breeze, and he stood still, as if waiting for someone, or saying goodbye. She rushed out, barefoot and breathless. "Lucas," she called, but he didn't turn. He raised a hand slowly, like a wave caught in slow motion. Then, as the mist thickened, he faded, not into the trees, but into the air itself, like memory dissolving into silence. The next morning, Elle found a letter on her pillow. It was in Lucas's handwriting. The ink was slightly smudged, like it had been written with trembling hands, or tears. "Elle, you gave me peace. You gave us a second ending. I was never meant to stay. I only came back to finish what time had stolen. I have been forgiven, and now I am free. Live the rest of this life for both of us, with everything I once was, and all I'll ever be. Louis." Elle cried then, not in despair, but in the fragile relief that comes with closure. She placed the letter in a glass case beside the old garden spade. And beneath it, the simple inscription, "You can bury a body, but not a bond." Years later, children would walk through the Beaumont estate with wide eyes, asking their parents, "Did the gardener really come back from the dead?" The adults would laugh awkwardly, unsure of how to answer. But Elle would sometimes sit by the rose arch and whisper, "He never left." Not really, because some portraits fade, but not the ones painted by love, and loss, and memory itself. Those, like ghosts, linger in the light,